Yo, what's up, guys? I woke up this morning and I left my Factorio paused last night. Oh, so I wasn't making materials overnight. Not good. Oh my god, we got our daily content. Nice one, Remy. Video not available anymore. Strike one. Oh, wait, I copied it wrong.
Hey everybody, Tim Miller from The Bulwark here with managing editor Sam Stein. We have breaking news. FBI Director Kash Patel says that he has arrested a judge.
Get these corrupt judges out of here.
On the charge of obstructing the arrest of an immigrant, an FBI operation to arrest an immigrant, I guess, in her court. I'm going to read the tweet from Kash Patel that he since deleted. So we'll get into that in a second. But
do you think you'll ever reach the point where you temporarily pause your differences with Hassan and Vosh in order to organize marches? With Hassan, never. He's the same side, or he's the opposite side of the same coin when it comes to the Trump shit. No illiberal people. I've actually considered it maybe with Vosh, but I've made too many mistakes in my career where I completely forgive somebody who's just been like absolutely fucking insane, and then that pattern repeats over and over again. So the ball's in his court on that one.
He wrote, just now, the FBI arrested Judge Hannah Duggan out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on charges of obstruction after evidence of Judge Duggan obstructing an immigration arrest operation. We believe Judge Duggan intentionally misdirected federal agents away from the subject to be arrested in her courthouse, Eduardo Ruiz, allowing the subject, an illegal alien, to evade arrest. Thankfully, our agents chased down the perp on foot, and he's been in custody since, but the judge's obstruction created increased danger to the public. We'll have more to share soon.
Serious question. Do you place much value in being right all the time or having a good thought process in order to be right most of the time? Would be curious to hear. I mean, those two things should generally be in alignment. You want a good thought process, and then you'd be right as a result of that most of the time, right?
So he tweeted that, then deleted it. Was unclear why, but I guess, Sam, now we have confirmation that this judge has been arrested.
Yeah, we were all sort of confused about why he deleted it, which led to us wondering if it was real. Normally, you would have like sort of a coordinated announcement around this stuff. It's all very bizarre. But then Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel has a piece that says that the arrest was confirmed by a local U.S. Marshal Services, DC U.S. Marshal Services spokesperson for them said that this judge was arrested at 8 a.m. at the Milwaukee County Courthouse and is in federal custody. So just let that sink in. We have arrested a local judge and detained her in federal custody over immigration proceedings. I can't recall anything remotely like this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, we're going to have to wait for more details to emerge before you get into total speculation mode, but just like at the top level, like arresting a judge over not like some other private crime, but of their of their job, like of judging, something that is part of their work.
Taking foreign bribes. Yeah, I can see that. Right.
Yeah, sure. A judge that is also happens to be a murderer or whatever. Okay, right. But this is a judge like in the process of we presume judging work. So that is noteworthy.
The arrest is I think the allegation specifically is they tipped off a person who was going to be arrested by ICE and tried to let this alleged target of the ICE officials evade arrest. And so it's an obstruction charge. Now, this is, again, maybe a little bit beyond my expertise, sending the FBI after a judge over this, as opposed to sort of trying to adjudicate in less dramatic fashion, is a choice, right? Like, that's a choice.
Well, here's another choice. The way that you announce it. I mean, like, I guess he's deleted it, but like that we have the FBI director, right? Like, this wasn't, Bob Mueller wasn't out there being like, we nabbed him, like we nabbed him. Like, the idea of doing this as ostentatiously as possible is also a choice. And it is, and I think that is what we can speak on, with full information right now, because what they're trying to do here is intimidate people. They're trying to intimidate officers of the court. They've already gone after lawyers representing undocumented migrants. And so they are trying to intimidate anybody that wants to give any aid and comfort to people that are in this country, not illegally. And and this is like a huge shot across the bow. Effort, right? And like that is what that is true. This,
and
this
I think
is like obvious.
And I think you have to put it in the context of what's been happening for like the past couple of weeks, which is the administration's had a series, just a series, like a torrent of judicial decisions handed down against them, many of which have restricted what they want to do on immigration. And they've responded by ratcheting up the rhetoric by saying, this is a judicial coup. These are liberal justices issuing nationwide injunctions. They've tried to, challenge the idea of being able to do nationwide injunctions. And they've basically been trying to fight this through more or less PR and legal battles. And now this, to me, and it's being presented this way too, is them responding to the justice system by actually flexing, real...
Yeah, the power of their Department of Justice.
Right, exactly. And so now you've pitted two parts of the justice system against each other.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, there's no doubt about that. And I also think this is notable in the context of the Trump Time interview that came out this morning, because Trump was pressed by Time magazine about the way that he's defied the Supreme Court. And it's interesting that Trump's rhetoric on this is like he is almost trying to ratchet it down. Like he is hiding behind lawyers, right? Like, and I think Trump thinks that the safe play here is to be like, I'm just whatever my lawyers tell me. If Kash Patel, if Pam Bondi says this judge needs to be arrested, okay, nothing I can do. I'm not like my hands are clean on this one. If the Supreme Court says I got to bring back Abrego Garcia, but Pam Bondi and my lawyers say that they interpret it differently. Well, okay, I got nothing, right? And so this is like the game Trump plays, where they can intimidate, they can act extrajudicially, and he is trying to like avoid like personal accountability for it by saying, okay, this is what those guys are doing. This is over there.
Right. He gets a little bit of a shield, right?
Yep.
There he's human shield. And so if this blows up in his face or in the administration's face, he'll just say, well, Kash decided. Kash just went ahead and did it. And who am I?
I thought you guys didn't want me to interfere with the DOJ. I thought you guys didn't want me to politicize. It's like I'm instructing you to investigate Chris Krebs. In this case, on one hand, but then on the other hand, when you guys go out and do something, I'm like, I can't do anything about that. Like this is the way that he's trying to have it. I think it's important just to like be blunt about that, so that to kind of expose like how they're going to try to have it both ways.
How does this play out from here, right? Like, obviously, this judge is going to challenge her arrest. I mean, she's not going to like just say, "Yeah, you got me." No, and the secondary question is, how does the other courts react to this, right? Like there is sort of a fraternalism around the judicial system. Yeah. Judges should, in theory, be appalled that one of their own was arrested. But I am curious. And also, how does it go for more adjudication of local immigration cases, right? Like, if you're a local judge and you're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is around the adjudication of the stuff, obviously they want you to think, well, the FBI might come knocking on your door if you go in the wrong direction.
Here's what I think. I think that the judicial system will fight back, and that we'll see a lot of pushback from judges. And but here's what I also think will happen.
It's like a million different fires right now.
There's going to be a chilling effect, though. Yeah. There's going to be a chilling effect, man. There are great people out there who work for nonprofits, who advocate for migrant groups, who will not be cowed by this. But there will be people that look at this and are just like, ugh. I don't want to deal.
This judge should have been arrested. I think this is a bad hill to die on. My voice means absolutely nothing here, and I know that in the context of everything happening, that people will seize on this case. This sounds like this judge was being a fucking retard, and this arrest was totally warranted. If everything in this affidavit is true, and it sounds like they have corroborating witnesses for all of this. Okay, so here's what it sounds like happened. Okay, so they have notice of somebody in the United States who shouldn't be here. He hasn't applied for any sort of, administrative hold or any kind of whatever you would do to like, hey, don't deport me or whatever. He hasn't done any of that. So the immigration police show up to the courthouse, to the district courthouse, to arrest this guy. Sorry, I'm trying to read this and listen to him at the same time, and reach out at the same time. It looked like somebody in chat said something like, do they really arrest people in courthouses? That seems like so weird. It seems like they do. And the reasoning that they provide in this affidavit actually makes sense. In the affidavit, they say that they arrest people in courthouses because, one, they know where the person's going to be. So it's obviously it's knowledge of where they are. And then two, it's a secure area. So it's a general safe place for officers and everybody to do their business. You know the person's going to be in court. You know they have to go through security. You know exactly when they're going to be there. You know there aren't going to be any guns or confrontation because they can't be armed because they go through security. And not only do they say that they've actually done 2 of these in the same area. I'm aware that 2 prior arrests in public areas of the Milwaukee County Courthouse complex of individuals who were not lawfully present in the United States had received public attention. Both incidents involved individuals who'd been charged with criminal offenses, but were not in custody and appearing for scheduled hearings in their criminal cases. I'm also aware that pursuant to the policy, so they've done this before in these courthouses. It sounds like what happened is once the judge was made aware, once she was made aware that there were immigration police there, she got, it says, visibly irate and was arguing with multiple people, and then asked to see the administrative warrant, got that, took the officers with her out of the courtroom, I guess, to go and talk to the chief judge of the courthouse. And then after that, apparently she came back and she helped the guy who was here illegally sneak out of the courthouse through the jury exit. Bro, that's obstruction like crazy. There's no shot you can do that. And then once he'd snuck out of the courthouse through the jury exit, they chased him down on foot and arrested him. Nah, that's absolutely no bueno. If you want to fight on the principle that like no illegal alien should be deported or whatever, I guess that's fine. But you're 100% at fault for every single thing there. Yeah, I don't know. Unless there are things in this affidavit that aren't correct, and more information comes out or something, then I would change my mind. But this judge seems like that was dumb as fuck. But this is just an affidavit, so it could be that there are things in here that aren't true, or there's another legal aspect of this that I'm missing because I'm just not aware of it, so who knows. But that's just from reading this thing is kind of... Someone in YouTube chat said she's contesting this story from what I heard.
Deal with the Trump DOJ, if I'm housing an illegal migrant, if I'm doing something like I do think that that is where they will be successful. I think they will eventually lose. Again, we don't know the details of this particular case, but like they will continue to lose these broader fights in the courts where they're breaking the Constitution. Right. But I think that they will succeed in the chilling effect, and that's really it's really bleak.
It's somewhat related here, but the whole immigration thing. There's like 2 parallel storylines going on, and I think you hit on it. One is like the big national headline stories: Abrego Garcia, Andrei, the barber, and those are taking all 95% of the auction. But then the 5% is what's happening locally, the stuff like in Milwaukee, and that's actually more consequential in a way, because this is where you're starting to see some really kind of nasty stuff. And so someone passed on our tips line, which, by the way, use the tips line. It's great. What is it called?
Theborg.com/tips.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. So there's a local story out of Dayton about a barber. This guy who has been here for, decades, Honduran native. He's been here illegally, but forever. He's had, sort of an understanding with local officials where he would wear a monitoring bracelet as his asylum process went through the system. And this is so messed up. But they basically said to him, this is how it reads. It says, ICE called Rodriguez, the guy, and told him he didn't need his bracelet anymore, and he should come to the Blue Ash, Kentucky office to have it removed. What officials didn't tell him is that he would be arrested and sent to the Butler County, Ohio jail, where he's being held currently. Jail records show. This is the stuff. It's this local stuff. I know, it's horrible. It's this local stuff that's happening all over the country. Now we're seeing it here and there. And then, of course, in Milwaukee now you have this confrontation, this arrest of a judge. This is what I think is like the real story. And I think this is also what's contributing to a lot of the backlash against Trump, is that people don't like this shit. I don't think normal Americans are like, yeah, let's have a judge get arrested by the FBI because they might have like tipped off, someone here illegally. I think that stuff is the stuff that people recoil at.
All right, much more on this to come. Our colleague Adrian Carrasquillo, who writes our immigration newsletter, which you guys should check out at thebulwark.com, will do more reporting on this. Send us tips if you guys tips, thebulwark.com/tips, and subscribe to us on YouTube. And we'll be talking to y'all soon. Thanks, Sam. See you, everybody.
Thanks.
Hey, YouTube fam.
YouTube fam?
If you want to support The Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some...
If ICE acts against the law, e.g. possibly deporting an El Salvador or to El Salvador, rights-free prisons, can't you make an argument that it's reasonable action by the judge? No. What? Because a federal official has taken an illegal action once, now you can ignore all federal officials? Of course not. Yeah, they got our boy Santos. Not good. Not good. We gotta break him out, guys.
So last week, I did this episode called The Emergency is Here. The crisis is now.
Isn't part of the issue that administrative warrants, which aren't judicial warrants, might not allow for an arrest in a courtroom? I'm pretty sure... Okay, careful. I'm not a lawyer. I think the administrative warrant would allow you to arrest somebody if they're in a public place and they're not currently under in somebody else's custody. So if he just showed up for trial and he's not under arrest at that moment, he's not in the custody of any police force, if he just showed up for trial there and then he left, they'd be able to arrest him in the courthouse or right outside, I guess. But also, if you think that they're not allowed to, then you would just, then that's what the grounds that you would fight on. You wouldn't try to sneak him out of the courtroom. It's probably not the smartest idea.
It's not 6 months away. It's not another Supreme Court ruling from happening. It is happening now. And the problem with an episode like that is it's a little bit hard to know how to follow it. The most common reaction we got was, oh, so you think there's going to be midterms? One thing I've noticed is a tendency, an understandable one I've used too, to understand what Trump is doing here as best analogized to something that's happened somewhere else at another time in another place.
Literally saying things straight out of Putin's playbook.
Franco had used a version of that. Mussolini has used a version of that. Hitler has used a version of that.
Similarities to what happened in Germany and what's happening now in America are just undeniable.
But one thing that looking at these other analogies for all of their uses can do is make it seem like what's happening here has no precedent here. But it does. Deportations, expulsions.
Holy shit, it's the
deep
Nazis.
form of politically potent illiberalism has always been with America. And so I wanted to have on Stephen Hahn today. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at New York University, the author of the book Illiberal America, and he traces these tendencies back all through our history in a way that I think is a bracing reminder that this is a fight that has been going on here for a long time. It's something that we have been in conflict with, pulling in and out of, with losses and with victories, and that happens in our context, with our institutions, and with our politics. Stephen Hahn, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
More like
so in
Stephen
Trump's first term, we often heard the advice.
Honking. Get it? If Stephen Hawking was a duck, do you know what they'd call him? Stephen Honking.
Don't normalize him. This is not normal. This is abnormal. We would hear, this is not who we are. And your view is this is sort of normal. This is part of who we are and always has been.
Well, I think that there was a deep desire to think about a set of liberal democratic norms, the use of the term norms, as a way of understanding how we have been as a people and how we have practiced politics. And therefore, there was, as alarming as Trump may have been, there was something comforting about thinking that this was a weird abnormality. It was kind of a noxious weed that had sprouted.
A dying gasp of an old order.
Either that or as a dangerous protrusion of a new order potentially coming into being, but that could be pulled out and we would go back to normal. I was really struck in 2015-16, not so much by him per se, but by journalists and other very thoughtful observers who were aghast at his various violations of liberal democratic norms, even though for the previous 2.5-3 decades, they had been undermined in so many different respects, but wanting to hold on to them and not to normalize him.
So you write that liberalism is, quote, deeply embedded in our history, not at the margins, but very much at the center. When you say that, what is the illiberalism you're talking about?
Well, I'm talking about a way of thinking about the world that has to do with the embrace of inequality, inherent inequalities, about hierarchies of nation and race and gender, about a desire for cultural and or religious uniformity, a particularist idea about rights, meaning you don't carry your rights with you. You may have them where they are, but you don't have them all the time. An idea of marking internal as well as external enemies and the use of exclusion or expulsion as a way of dealing with this. Thinking about the access to and maintenance of power with the legitimacy of political violence. And as much as anything, really it's about the will of the community over the rule of law. And I think understanding this as a set of ideas and relationships that really preceded the European colonization of North America has, in some preceded liberalism and then became very much entangled to it, but had a logic of its own.
Let's go into a bit of that historical depth. One of the parts of your book I found interesting was your analysis of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. That's normally seen as a document laying out the early structure of America's inevitable ascent into liberal democracy. And you read it quite differently.
I do. I read it both in terms of his interest and admiration for what he saw as a robust individualism and equality, but I also read it as a series of warnings about where this could be headed. The largest section of his warnings had to do with his very long chapter on slavery and race, which he recognized infused the entire country. In fact, he thought racism was more powerful where slavery had been abolished than where slavery still existed. But I was especially interested in how he understood local democracy and local politics in general, the collective and associational activities. And what worried him was what he called the tyranny of the majority, the narrowness of mind, the way in which associations on the ground tended to both emphasize certain ideas about belonging, but at the same time put those who didn't fit in into real jeopardy. He ended up arguing that he thought it was likely, or is certainly possible, that the United States could very, very quickly move toward a despotism, and where people would be willing to give up their rights in loyalty to a strong man. So you read this and you think, I think he really had his finger on things that were going on in the 1830s that oftentimes, as you mentioned, are kind of overlooked because it has become one of those texts that are iconic in establishing ideas of American exceptionalism. And it was republished during the early phases of the Cold War when ideas about American exceptionalism and American consensus were taking great strength.
So in the 1830s, you also have an example of the tradition you're talking about at really full strength under Andrew Jackson. And you have a chapter on this, in particular around Jackson's use of deportations and expulsions, which you see as central to the illiberal tradition, and I think is central to the sort of story we're tracking here. So tell me a bit about that decade from your perspective.
Right. Obviously, the expulsion of native peoples from their lands east of the Mississippi to what was regarded as Indian territory, which was really the first territory in the United States that was not imagined as heading towards statehood. So it's not entirely clear what it was. This was the end of a process that had begun back in the 17th century that was directed toward removing, expelling native people. But the thing that's important to recognize is that this was a central aspect of American society and political culture in that period. Free African Americans were targeted for expulsion. It was called colonization. This goes back to the 18th century, and even Thomas Jefferson, who couldn't really imagine how white and black people could live together under conditions of freedom in some ways that Tocqueville re-articulated. But there were mobs that were focused on driving out not only African Americans in cities where they were free or had escaped from enslavement, Catholics, Mormons. Joseph Smith is murdered in the 1840s, not far from Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's place. Abolitionists. The 1830s were a time of these, anti-abolitionist riots in cities large and small because...
In some ways, it's good to to talk about like the best things that America's done to get people to kind of like realize like, hey, we can be better than we are right now. But in other ways, it's good to be realistic about where we've come from too. I feel like a lot of what this guy's talking about was some of my complaints with that one newsroom scene where the guy's like, America used to be great. We aren't anymore, but we used to be real good, and now we've lost it. And it's like, well, America's done a lot of fucked up shit too, right? It's not like we've always been this amazing place, or we used to be this super ultra amazing place, and just recently it's gotten really bad. Like we've done fucked up shit. It's a part of our history,
Because they were accused of promoting miscegenation. And what was the remedy? The remedy was to drive them out, drive them off.
Tell me a bit about the rhetoric Jackson uses to justify the expulsions. If somebody's reading it today, how much of it would read horrifying and archaic to our ears? We don't think like that anymore. And how much would not? How much would we hear resonance in?
That's a really good question. And in fact, it suggests the way in which historical understanding and thinking has really changed. One of the reasons that Jackson attained heroic proportions for a very long time was his status as an enslaver, and his multifaceted role as an Indian fighter tended to be diminished. And what was emphasized was his apparent support for the common man, popular democracy, the age of Jackson, so to speak. You know, Jackson thought, like many white Americans thought, is that Native people were, they didn't belong, that they were in jeopardy of basically dying out, and that what he was doing was actually in their interest by finding a territory outside of the centers of population where Native people could in some ways be safe. You know, we only would read this in a horrifying way because of what we've learned about the history of Native peoples, the really complicated history of Native peoples, and how this has been a long-term process of expulsion. So he tried to dress it up as something that he was doing as an alternative to their physical destruction and their dying out. But, you know, I think a modern reader, by and large, who knew anything about the history of the United States and of Native people would recognize what he was really after.
How connected is it to Jackson's politics of the common man? How much does the support of the common man...
Do you think the idea of American exceptionalism is positive or toxic? Americans, we do have respective exceptionalism in Europe, but it's a bit different. I think exceptionalism is good. It's like patriotism versus nationalism. Like, it's good. You just have to be realistic about it. But, like, you should be proud of your country or love your country and, you know, feel patriotic about your country. But you should also, you know, it's simultaneously recognizing your strengths and your faults, which seems very hard for a lot of people.
Man, the channeling of the common man braid itself into this project of who you have to push out so they're not part of the common man.
Right. I think he saw himself as representing the interests of white Americans in the Trans-Appalachian West, who themselves were in the process of trying to expand their population and settlements, which would be at the expense of Native people. And so, in a sense, what Jackson really represented was, you know, he was the first president from the Trans-Appalachian West. He had strong support among white adult men from that area and also from the southern states because he was a slave owner and he was committed to the maintenance of slavery. So, you know, at the same time, access to politics in the United States, in most states, in terms of voting and office holding, property holding requirements were being dropped. And so adult white men had more access than ever. And so even though in most places people of African descent didn't, women didn't, in some ways the workforce in many, many places didn't because they were made up of women and children. But nonetheless, there was kind of the sense that the groundwork for what would be an expansive democracy was being laid then.
Jackson is interesting, I think, in this moment particularly, because he is very explicitly talked about as a model for Donald Trump. Trump restored his portrait to the Oval Office. When you hear Trump and the people around him, like Steve Bannon in the first term, who talk a lot about Jackson, who lionize Jackson, what do you hear them connecting to in him?
Well, I think there are a number of things that they could connect to, not least was his defiance of a Supreme Court rulings on the potential expulsion of Native people. You know, he said, like, okay, that's fine, let them enforce it. I think they see him as a quote-unquote strong leader who was willing and able and interested in moving directions of his own choosing. Obviously, he had a very complicated relationship with the federal government, but he stood up very strongly because the nullification crisis in the 1830s when South Carolina said, unlike Jackson's view of the Supreme Court, no, we're not going to enforce the tariff. Jackson threatened to really crush them militarily as well as politically. So I think they see him as an example of an early executive who was interested in expanding the powers of the presidency at a time when the president of the United States really had relatively few powers, and the important power remained in the states and nationally in the Congress. And I think they saw him as a harbinger of what would happen later and what Trump clearly admires.
Let me move forward in time a bit to the Red Scare. Yep. You spend some real time in the book on the Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920. What were they?
Well, the Palmer raids are called the Palmer raids because the Attorney General of the United States was A. Mitchell Palmer. I think it was an example of how, political people who were regarded by those in power as politically objectionable could suffer all sorts of forms of repression, including expulsions of various sorts. It included people who were isolationists, but it's also included people who were on the left, first socialists who had a complicated history with that, and then after the Russian Revolution, people who were associated with the spread of communism, or those who quite simply did not fit into their view of what the United States should be, which is a republic of white Christians. And in that particular time, the federal government became involved in the repression of these movements, and whether it involved prosecuting them. I mean, Eugene Debs ran for president from jail, or whether it had to do with expelling them, not only communists and socialists, but people who were accused of anarchism. Sacco and Vanzetti, it became a very notorious example of how that could happen. It's important to recognize that.
How does YouTube chat function compared to Twitch for streamers? It's more or less the same thing, no? The biggest issue, I think, or one of the big issues that I feel like YouTube has that I don't think they've ever fixed, I don't know why, they just don't care about fixing it, or they don't, I say fix, it's not really fix, it's a feature ad or feature request, is for some reason, emotes can't carry over from one stream to another. Like if I subscribe to a YouTuber, I can't use their emotes or whatever in another YouTuber's chat. I feel like that hurts like cohesive YouTube culture. I feel like it does, but...
that the Ku Klux Klan was in the process of reorganizing in this period. It was reestablished during the teens, but it really exploded in the 1920s, and it fed off a lot of these currents. It admired fascist regimes elsewhere. It admired the sort of political violence and paramilitarism that went into it. And it, one of the things that they did was enforce prohibition, which they regarded as an attack on the lifeways of European immigrants and others who were not white Christians.
Speaking of fascism, you have this argument that in the 20s, you have prohibition, as you're saying, the second KKK. You argue that, quote, the threads composing the fabric of Italian and German fascism were an earliest evidence, not in Europe, but at that moment in America.
Right.
Why?
Well, one of the things I try to do in the book, which is recognizing that illiberalism is not one thing. It's not an unchanging, static thing. It's a collection of ideas and notions of relationships or political power, is to think about how illiberalism was modernized during what we call the progressive period. And there, the idea of social engineering, the use of eugenics, which is oftentimes not adequately accounted for by historians of the period, disfranchisement, segregation, warfare overseas that was justified in racialized terms, the use of troops who basically got their experience in Indian wars in the Trans-Mississippi West, and the idea that was advocated by people. Herbert Crowley is a good example because he was one of the founders of the New Republic. He was one of the advocates of Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism. And yet, he was very suspicious of what he called Jeffersonian democracy. He thought that many people in the United States didn't understand the national purpose, and that therefore politics really should be conducted by those who were trained, by those who were experts.
I mean, doesn't Hitler praise American immigration
Not only
policy
that,
in this
he was
period?
a great advocate of westward expansion because this was the American version of breathing room. The Nazis and American scientists were sharing a lot of their work about eugenics. I mean, they kind of sensed that they were sort of they were involved.
I wanted to push back on that concept of breathing room. There's some German word, Strom, or I don't know what the fuck it is, that Hitler talked about a lot when it came to like rationalization for the expansion of Nazi Germany, because they needed room for all of the wonderful Germans. And I was going to fight with comparing that to America, but I guess we kind of did have the same concept. The only difference is the people that we needed to clear out were natives that nobody gave a fuck about. So I guess we got away with it better.
In a joint project. So I do think that without saying that the United States was moving in a Nazi direction, I mean, there were people, obviously, who in the 1930s very much embraced what was going on in Germany on many accounts. There were many people in the 20s and into the early 30s who thought that Mussolini was really pointing out the future that the Euro-Atlantic world was headed, because he seemed to be somebody who was active in...
Wait, what was this guy's background again? I think you have to be really, really, really careful when you start talking about some group of people were supportive of another group of people that we have modern, heavy connotations of. Like if you supported the Nazis or their rise to power in the early 30s, 1930s, that means something significantly different. You can say whether it was good or bad because of the anti-Semitism, or you can say whether it was good or bad because of the nationalism or whatever. Like you're allowed to have that opinion. But it means something significantly different to say that somebody supported the Nazis, in the early 1930s when they were rising up because of their strong nationalist bent or whatever, versus somebody thought that Holocaust was good. These are very, very different statements. But, okay.
Engaged, strong, and recognized the limitations of a kind of the liberal state that had really fallen into real question. The Klan was the largest social movement in the 1920s. and their ideas about what the United States would be. It was an early America Firstism. I mean, that's really where
I'm being a little nitpicky, though, I guess. I mean, like, largely this point is true, I guess.
It emerges. And so, again, I think that without necessarily saying that this was Italian fascism or this was Nazi, but which it wasn't, but to say that some of the ideas, some of the connections, and the overall project, the sense of who really should be participating in this, who shouldn't be participating.
But flip it, because I think so often in politics, particularly those of us who like thinking about ideas, we think about the supply side, not the demand side, to be an economist about it. We think about what politicians and political movements are offering, but those offerings only matter if they meet or create demand. And so, yes, what was happening in America is not Italian fascism. It's not Nazism. It's not anything that is anywhere else because we have our own context. But there is a demand for something
I think that's
is, at least
right.
in an early way, speaking to similar anxieties, speaking to similar views about belonging, speaking to similar...
It is really good to recognize the similarities, too, though, because this... Oh, my God. We'll go back to reading, I swear. Okay. The author of this book, the one that we're reading on Nazi Germany, points out a lot, and it's important to know that history could still go other ways, or history could have gone another way. There were a lot of moments in the rising of Nazi Germany, and of any country, really, where things could have been way different. We fall too much into this trap of assuming that history is inevitable, that one side would have always won, and things could have only gone this way. But the danger of that kind of thinking is that sometimes you're in historical moments before you realize it, and you don't want to be trapped in some moment where you think like, well, where we're at right now in life, it might be easy to think that, well, the quote unquote, the good guys always win, I guess, because you're part of this country now, and hopefully you think this country is better than the Nazis would have been. And so that's an inevitability, and no matter what happens, like things will always kind of work out. And that's not necessarily always true. Well, not necessarily. That's not true at all. Things could always be much worse or go a much different way. And it's important to recognize that.
Fears about what will happen to a country if it becomes too multicultural, or the power structure changes too much, or the wrong kinds of people are voting. I always make this mistake that we're so focused on what the politicians say that we forget that what they say only matters if it matches what the voters want.
I agree. I do think it is important to recognize the kind of social basis that existed for these ideas. Because, as horrific as we may find it, disfranchisement and segregation, Jim Crow, as we call it, only had pushback coming from the African Americans, and not all of them, but most of them. And most white Americans and political leaders thought that this was a perfectly reasonable, perfectly modern way of choreographing the great diversity and inequalities that existed in American society. So there's no question that these right-wing groups really did fulfill a need, but a sense of community building, a sense of what belonging was, belonging that not only included people you were comfortable with and you thought were part of the community, but non-belonging and the resistance or expulsion of those or the repression of those who you saw as political threats.
Tell me about the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924.
Well, that was really the first major immigration act that was passed. It established quotas for the first time. Before then, it was really the Chinese and then Asian exclusion acts, but which were not designed to have quotas, but designed not to have people from Asia come to the United States. The 1924 Immigration Act was different, and it was organized in such a way that it really did try to undercut the migration of people from certain parts of the world who were regarded as...
Did Dustin read the Atlantic article on Asmongold? Uh-oh. Did they write one on him?
Culturally unassimilable, as politically objectionable, as people who were breeders and therefore threatened the population balances in the United States, not simply by the numbers who arrived, but by the population increase once they got to the United States. And, when it was passed, I mean, in most major journalistic venues, it was celebrated. The New York Times, the LA Times, everyone sort of saying, yeah, this was the way in which we could preserve an America that we feel comfortable with. And, this was a law that was enforced until 1965. And not to mention that, Jews who were trying to flee Nazi Germany and then the Holocaust were themselves harmed by this. But I think it's part of a piece of what's happening in the 1920s as trying to offer belonging to people who could be easily assimilated and offering little but repression or non-belonging to people who couldn't.
We're talking here about substance. One thing that surprises me is that there's a style to illiberalism that recurs over place and time. And it's probably a good time to bring in Joseph McCarthy, who, as he's a politician and a political force, I think a much bigger political force than is now remembered. And he's remembered for, communist witch hunting.
Digging out communism, corruption, treason in government.
He's also a very early example of a populist style that Trump fits very well.
You have a choice in this new world, because the time will come when, how do you say, the wheat detaches from the chaff, Have you taken your German lessons?
Oh, yes, sir.
Good. You, how do you say thank you in German?
Oh, of course, sir. Let me see. It's,
Yes.
dank.
Yes, out with it.
Did we play Wolfenstein 2, or did I just play the first one? Which one do they cut his head off and reattach it? I forget.
Well into, and that gets embraced by elite dimensions of conservatism. William F. Buckley writes a book this sort of anti-McCarthy is the way I put it. Like, okay, yeah, McCarthy maybe goes a bit too far, but the people who oppose him are the real problem, which is a very common form of Donald Trump defense. Tell me a bit about McCarthy's political style, the anti-elitism of it, the populism of it, the way he wraps up his liberalism.
Well, one of the things that became part of the reception of McCarthyism, especially among historians, was to liken it to 19th century populism, because they saw the very much of what you're describing, the kind of anti-elitism, his emergence out of a particular social setting, his finding of enemies, internal as well as external. People emphasize some of the unsavory aspects of 19th century populism, which I think were greatly exaggerated, at a time when mass movements were held in a lot of suspicion by historians, journalists, and scholars, because they had just come out of a war, recognizing that fascism, was a mass movement. It wasn't simply taking of power, coup d'etat on the part of a small elite or oligarchy. And so, McCarthy is now, not surprisingly, getting a new look by people on the political right, precisely because they felt that he had the courage to stand up to those who were threatening American values and American politics. And he did this, at great, in the end, personal cost. But I mean, Joseph McCarthy fit into a framework in which a lot of this was going on anyway. And it was not only going on among Republicans, it was going on among Democrats. I mean, what historians have found is that actually the people who voted for populists in the past were not the people who voted for McCarthy, at least in terms of their social profiles. And so that was sort of debunked. And that McCarthy was not a kind of new 19th century populism. He was really appealing to a different kind of constituency, obviously more native-born, but not entirely native-born. People who were sort of small business types.
I want to hold on the anti-elitism and the anti-institutionalism of him for a second, because one way I've heard McCarthy being brought up as a referent to what is happening now is, look, he was on the hunt for communists. There were communists at different layers of American life. And he also had a broader view, as did many others in conservatism at that time, that the big institutions of American life had been captured.
By the Jews.
And, the culture had been captured in Hollywood, and the universities were captured, and maybe even the government was captured too.
Definitely Jews.
And the
military.
And military. And the hunt for communists, which I've seen people analogizing now to the hunt for people who believe in DEI or anti-Semites or wokeness, also became a way to break open these institutions, to use the power of the state to cow them, and to force them to come back into some kind of alignment, or at least stop opposing the alignment with what McCarthy represented and the political tendencies that he fought for. How valid do you think that?
Okay. I don't want to ruffle any feathers here. Does anybody feel like Ezra Klein speaks a little bit too dramatically? Like a little Voshonian, kind of? I feel like he could tone it back like 25%.
Well, one of the things we have to recognize is that the federal state grew enormously from the 1930s through the 1940s into the 1950s. I think McCarthy was in part representing a certain unease and suspicions about that, about a world of people who were trained into these institutions, what expansive and bureaucratic institutions might involve. There's no question, I think, that he directed attention and concern to institutions that really didn't have a deep history in the United States, that were far from the direct reach of many Americans who were themselves experiencing enormous change, whether it had to do in bigger cities. I mean, a lot of these struggles over housing, people had this idea, well, it wasn't until the 1960s when the urban uprisings began, but actually it was much earlier.
Isn't it kind of weird that we conflate Nazi and neo-Nazi ideology? The Nazis killed what they consider to be inferior whites while ignoring non-white populations. Neo-Nazis specifically target people, non-white people. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like you should call them like DEI Nazis or something, although nobody would take it seriously. But in some ways, I've made this joke before, but it is true. In some ways, I think that the neo-Nazis in the United States, I think, represent just like how far diversity and stuff in the United States has come, and how arbitrary like racial distinction is. Like if you can have like white nationalists or neo-Nazis that are like Nick Fuentes, like Hispanic in origin, that says a lot about the arbitrariness, I guess, of what it means to be white, or just racial categories in general, right?
as there were housing shortages, there were population, demographic migrations. And so I think he did appeal to those who were trying to hold on to a kind of sense of community that they saw in part being overrun. And by going after the institutions and suggesting that not only were they far from you, but they were being infested by people who didn't have your interest in mind at all, whatever you understood about socialism, communism, or the left.
One of the things we're seeing now is different institutions in American life having to make this choice. Do they try to make a deal with the administration? Do they try to bend the knee to the administration? Or do they fight? Right? Harvard just decided to fight. In the McCarthy era, how would you tell that story of the institutional response? Like, what was the period? Were they lockstep in trying to submit to this until something changed? What can be learned from that now?
I think the response was mostly bending the knee. I think that universities, workplaces, other institutions were very quick to try to identify people who could be regarded as threats. And for the most part, they were expelled. People lost their jobs. They were blacklisted. They were run out of important political positions, or they could not seek. They were excluded from labor unions at a very critical point in our labor history in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when organizations like the CIO were increasingly powerful. So I do think that bending the knee, especially in the...
Would Proud Boys be considered neo-Nazi type? I feel like I've seen enough. I feel like Proud Boys in general would probably be considered neo-Nazis, because I think they believe like in all the weird Jewish conspiracy shit and everything, right? Basically, if you have anybody that has any form of like white identitarianism, meaning usually that implies some form of like racial essentialism, meaning you think that the phenotype of a race is a culture, and that comes from a genotype. So different races have different cultures, and that's essential to the race. It's built in. And then you mix that with a little bit of Jewish conspiracy theory. I would consider that. So any kind of like white identitarianism, racial essentialism, plus any kind of like Jewish conspiracy stuff. That's enough for me to say it's probably like neo-Nazi, I guess. But also, I'm also not as interested sometimes in the neo-Nazi label, because people just want to have the label so that they can bring in all the morality. Yeah, the morality, like the moral condemnation, the normative badness of Nazis. But I'm more interested in identifying it or whatever.
The face of what seems to be significant power is not uncommon and is a worrisome precedent.
So we've been talking here about political figures and political groups, McCarthy, Jackson, the Ku Klux Klan, that to the extent people think about an illiberal tradition, they all fit very squarely in it. One of the points of your book is that liberalism and illiberalism are often braided together in the same people. So around this time, we have Japanese internment, and you have over 100,000 people.
A good modern difference between Nazi and fascism would be people like the Proud Boys versus the new tech bro, technocrat fascists. Typically, when like a 6-month-old child hits somebody else, usually you don't even scold the child. They're so young. They're just like flailing their limbs around. You would never describe like a 6-month-old child as evil. Just on the limited stuff I've seen from tech bros, I don't know if I would ever... Now, maybe there's a tech movement like the Peter Thiel stuff, maybe, where you'd call them like techno-fascists or whatever. From what I've seen from Silicon Valley types that get into politics, these people are too stupid and too politically illiterate to be called fascists. They don't even have enough political thought in their brains to even be called fascists. They're just retarded. I don't even know how I would be tasked with describing the political beliefs of some of these people. They're so simple and basic and stupid and naive and retarded. Just retarded.
Around this time, we have...
Dude, gamers made a better, more coherent political splash when it came to like entering politics or having political thought than the crypto bros. It's unbelievable to me how disappointing it's been to see how fucking stupid people could be when they're, I don't know, man, Jesus Christ.
Liberalism and illiberalism are often braided together in the same people. So around this time, we have Japanese internment, and you have over 100,000 people, many of them citizens, rounded up and put in camps. No due process, no ability to have a court, decide if they were actually a threat to the country. And this is done by...
Curtis Yarvin is at least a thinker. You can say he's stupid, but at least he's thought about things. Now, whether I think he's retarded, no, I wouldn't describe him as retarded. Or if I would describe him as retarded, I would describe him as retarded because I disagree with him, but not retarded because he's an actual thoughtless buffoon. But listening to that one, Andres, he looks like the guy that made Minecraft to me. Fuck, whatever that guy. God, oh my God, he's just so stupid. Holy shit, he's just thoughtless. thoughtless and stupid. Oh my God.
By liberal hero FDR. How do you think about what leads to that?
I do think that one of the challenges that liberals have had is that even though they may embrace a whole variety of ideas and relationships that we may find admirable, that nonetheless, I think they are interested in maintaining social order. That in many of them, they still do have an acceptance of cultural hierarchies. I mean, look, the liberals played a very important role.
Mark Anderson,
the so-called McCarthyism. Maybe the leaders, Arthur Schlesinger, and the establishment of Americans for Democratic Action, and all of this was to try to sort of hive liberals off the left of American society. Not only that, but condemn the left as followers and people who really should be subject to deep suspicion. And it was okay if you fired them, from universities or other positions because they were evil. They were the internal, enemies. And I do think that liberals were not very well equipped for the sort of unravelings that began to take place, and that they kind of begin to abandon the whole project.
One read of what you write in the book is this idea that the liberals their project is often compromised by a desire for social order, by some of the same
liberals,
yes. by some of the same dynamics you're pointing out among the illiberal side of American politics. And another way that I think that same dynamic can be read, and here I'm not supporting Japanese internment, but I do want to raise this as a question, is that the liberals who are nationally successful often contain some of this countercurrent inside of them. That you are describing such a strong and present and enduring ideological faction in American politics that it isn't going to be a surprise that FDR, that Lyndon Johnson, who contains the American South inside of him, that Bill Clinton in a very different way, who's sort of a merger of unusual currents, that Barack Obama, who part of what his genius is being able to speak to the white end black story and fears and anxieties in politics at the same time. That much of what ends up getting remembered as disappointing about them, I think from a different perspective, has been a pluralism that I think their defenders certainly would say kept some of these other currents in check. Mm-hmm. Because it sort of drained some of their opponents of power. Definitely Bill Clinton's defenders often say to me, I had Rahm Emanuel on the show, he said this explicitly, look, this is the guy who took crime and immigration off the table as weaknesses in welfare for the Democratic Party. And as the Democrats came back to national power. And now it's looked back on as, a terrible set of compromises, but that was, the alternative was losing to these.
You gotta, I don't know how to get this point across to people. Sometimes problems are real. And when a problem is real, it's good to talk about it. But just because a problem is real in one place, whether we're talking a place in time or a place in history, doesn't mean that it's real everywhere. Violent crime was exploding in the 90s in the United States. Things like crack cocaine were legitimately destroying entire communities and neighborhoods. Okay, our violent crime peaked so high in the 90s. It was insane. For people that look back harshly on things like the crime bill, they just were racist, they were horrible. No, everybody wanted more police in the United States. Everybody wanted more crackdown on criminals. There were still issues with racial disparity in police forces, in disparate outcomes, and how people were being treated in the judicial system, not just because they were committing more crime, because people were more racist, but that was a real thing. Same thing today in the world, how eager everybody is to kind of have the same exact political groups across borders. Like people that are Brexiters, really want to be Trumpals, and people that support Andrew Tate also really want to support the AFD. And we're all the same, guys. We all have the same. We all have the same problems, and that's just not true. Immigration. I'll say this a billion times. Stay mad. Well, you guys won't be mad because my dick sucks. Immigration is just not that big of an issue in the United States. We can take so many more immigrants and be fine. We put these motherfuckers to work like crazy. But in other countries, it is a lot more challenging to deal with a large influx of immigrants, whether it's all of the Indian students that are going to Canada and driving up the cost of houses and changing the way that a lot of things look for better or for worse in a lot of different ways, or whether you're talking about certain European countries that took on a lot of Muslim immigrants during certain refugee crises. There's different countries have different problems, and to pretend that it's all the same shit and then to use the same talking points and to paint with a broad brush is stupid. I've said this a million times.
That is. How do you think about that tension?
Well, I think it's important to describe it as a tension. I think it's certainly the case with many liberals who have ascended to important leadership positions in American political life, that it comes with the terrain of seeking office and dealing with complicated constituencies and our own complicated past. I mean, obviously, people in the Democratic Party through the 1960s, had the southern wing of the party that they had to appease. And, you can excuse it from today until tomorrow, but they did. And, Johnson famously said when he was signing either the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights, now we've lost the South for a generation, and that was true. It's also important for us to recognize that, across our history, most of the political regimes, so to speak, were regimes that were conservative. The United States have a very, very, not simply overall violent history, but a politically violent history. It's not as if liberal democracy and political violence were separate or parallel. They were interconnected, from the beginning, and usually to the benefit of people with wealth and power and people who wanted to exclude, large sections of the American public from having decision-making power and authority.
I think this starts to bring us into something more modern. Trump often references an immigration policy called Operation Wetback. Operation Wetback comes under President Dwight Eisenhower, who we now look back on as this icon of moderate republicanism, even maybe a liberal Republican. We quote his speech about the defense industrial complex.
Whoa, bro.
What was Operation Wetback?
Well, we need to understand that in relationship to the Bracero program, which was a sort of government-sponsored program that was meant to provide labor for mostly for big agriculture, but not only for big agriculture, and so that immigrants had the right to work, and they usually were moving back and forth across the border. But by the 1950s, this was coming under attack, and therefore Operation Wetback was an attempt to sort of push that back across the Rio Grande and back into Mexico. But the idea was to basically deport people. And it kind of expressed, one of the really complicated aspects of American, economic development and policy, which is on the one hand, it depended so heavily on so many different groups of immigrants. And on the other hand, there was hostility to them, especially by that time to those of Mexico. It sort of gives us an idea of the really, sort of repressive impulses and the ease of building a repressive apparatus. Dwight D. Eisenhower, admittedly, it's easy to look back compared to what we're situated with now. But, when the Warren Court came down with the Brown decision in 1954, his response was, appointing Earl Warren to the court was the worst mistake he ever made. And they had to, go through a second Brown decision to provide some means of enforcement.
One thing in that era, though, is you have American citizens being deported. And one reason I'm interested in it, in addition to the fact that Trump allies use it as an example now, is that it's a reminder that we have done deportations in violations of rights people were assumed to have had many, many, many times before.
I think that's right. Certainly, we know that during the time of the Red Scare, in the period of World War I, that there were lots of immigrants who were also politically radical, who were deported and whose rights were regarded in very, very limited ways, and whose deportation was generally embraced, accepted by the public. In some ways, it's because the advent of citizenship and the 14th Amendment, as strong as it was in many respects, didn't really, if you compare that to the Mexican Constitution in 1916, that laid out a whole series of rights that working people had, that women had, and you compare it to a sense of, well, what are the rights that come with citizenship in the United States? But I worry, as you may worry too, that precisely because a lot of those rights are not clearly established, and because there could be any one of a variety of loopholes, whether in the language or whether in the way citizenship and rights are conceived, that we may be entering a period, in some ways marked by like the Dobbs decision of the really withdrawal of rights that we had come to believe that people have.
One thing you're gesturing at here, which I think is important, is the way in which we seem to phase in and out of periods. And oftentimes, even from a decade before what you're about to be in feels unimaginable. And so when we talk about the Palmer raids, they lead, in a sense, to the founding of the ACLU. We're talking about Operation Wetback, but it's just over a decade later that LBJ overturns the Johnson-Reed Act, and those sort of racist quotas dissolve, at least for that period of time. And so how do you think about this question of the cycles of it? Is it a pendulum that one action creates a backlash? Is it much more contingent and unpredictable than that? I mean, you go from Obama to Donald Trump, right? There is this way in which one era feels...
That's pretty wild.
It often feels much more radically different, almost radically opposite to the era that preceded it.
It seems to me, I'm not somebody who thinks about pendulums.
Same thing with the, it's very strange. I don't know if there's been like a coherent explanation for this, or if it's just like accepted as a thing that is. It's very strange that Americans, our elections are always like very close. Like our parties are always about 50-50. And then when one side wins, usually in the midterms, the next side wins. Like that's just like a thing that is observed so often. It's just weird how closely balanced everything is. Balancers in chat. This is why we ban balancers.
I don't think that history repeats itself, but I do think that there are moments when circumstances make possible developments moving in any one of a number of directions. And so, even if you think about Obama and Trump, I think it follows perfectly. Obama gets elected, and everybody was talking about how we were now in a post-racial society. And then two blinks, the Tea Party is organized, and basically Obama draws out a lot of deep racism in American society and senses that a black person like him should not legitimately hold the power he does. And therefore you have a birther movement which really harks back to Reconstruction when, Southern whites recognized that slavery was over, but the idea of empowering former slaves was just inconceivable to them. And you realize some of the depictions of Obama, in African dress and so on and so forth, I think suggests, I think, it's an interesting question about...
And Trump rides birtherism to the forefront of the Republican Party.
Absolutely. He found his way into leadership precisely in that, even when it was debunked, even when it was absolutely clear that this was a lie, nonetheless, most Republicans still believed that it was this idea of the general illegitimacy of certain groups of people holding power and breaking the hierarchies that they thought were essential to stability and security in the United States.
In your book, you frame the rise and era of mass incarceration as another example of the
like people are saying even 2008 that those weren't close, but maybe by U.S. standards they weren't, but it still feels like this is decently close. These are considered a blowout. Okay, these are blowout elections. 2008, Obama had 69.5 million votes. McCain had up 60 million votes. So was it a blowout? Yeah, by American standards, but even that feels fairly close. It wasn't 100 million to 10 million, or something like some crazy blowout like that, like an actual crazy blowout.
Deportation and expulsion impulse, finding policy expression. That in a way looks at least facially different, right? People aren't leaving the country. Now we're possibly going to do mass incarceration in El Salvadoran prisons as opposed to American ones.
Yeah, I feel like the last blow up was probably Reagan. And even that, was that 30-70 for popular vote? Reagan, election, Ballotpedia, Ronald Reagan. Wait. Even this was 60-41, which is still a blowout, 59-41. It's a blowout by US standards, but still not insanely, ultra, unbelievably crazy,
But tell me about the continuities you draw there.
I think that it's important to recognize that, first of all, we have a long history of incarcerating people. And from the birth of the penitentiary in the early 19th century on, the people who were incarcerated, wherever they were incarcerated, were disproportionately poor, disproportionately immigrants, disproportionately black. I do think that basically what happened was after the enormous urban unrest in the 1960s, that there was kind of the sense that, they could, militarily occupy big cities, or they could find other ways of pacifying and repressing the populations. And I think part of what happens is that, there is a bipartisan consensus on crime as a problem that's out of control, people of color as those who are most threatening, most dangerous, and that effectively deporting them from society and putting them in institutions where at least they were under, direct surveillance and repressive control. And we have to, again, remember that, what happens is they're not only expelled from, communities, but they're effectively expelled from political society, because not only don't they have, political rights, and they had to fight for whatever civil rights they, do they have a right to sue? Do they have a right to, challenge the structures of power within penitentiaries? I fear that a lot of people would be okay with expelling citizens who are deemed to be true enemies of the people because of their violence or because of their racial and ethnic background.
Trump is racist explicitly now.
Explicitly. And, whatever the courts do, he's obviously looking for a confrontation. He's interested in provocation. And he thinks basically there's nothing much they can do about it. And that may prove to be the case.
So when you look across these different episodes, we've talked about some of them, there are others in your book, what feel to you like the commonalities of these eras of deportation and expulsion? How does the political system, or at least a faction in it, come together and say, the rights have gone too far, the community has expanded too much? What seems to connect the periods, and what feels new to you in some of them or in this moment?
I do think that what happens is that it's very easy to invoke a notion of communities under siege, being threatened. It reminded me of what ideas and relationships that could so quickly be reconfigured about belonging, and what the even before the United States became the United States, but what it meant to be part of communities, what rights communities had to exclude or to expel, to punish. One of the things we saw is that there were members of quote-unquote immigrant groups who supported Trump, and this is part of a long-term phenomenon whereby those who have arrived in established stability, this is true during the Great Migration too, where northern black communities were, not all that comfortable with these rural black people who were coming up, who didn't really know the ways and were potentially threatening the stability of their own communities. It's an easy thing to kind of drum up because it has been so much part of the conversation for so long.
After canceling thousands of foreign students' immigration records, threatening their ability to study and live in the U.S., the Trump admin has reversed course and restored them all. It follows intense pushback from courts across the country. ICE had terminated the records of thousands of students from a federal database called SEVIS that tracks their legal status in the country. The effect of those terminations was in dispute, but many students said they had been barred from continuing their studies and were at risk of deportation. The reason ICE appeared to have canceled their SEVIS records, minor legal infractions that showed up in criminal history searches, which the law explicitly says is not a basis to deny a foreign student studying on an F-1 visa their legal status. Now, after dozens of judges across the country flagged the likely illegality, ICE says they won't do it anymore. Okay. By my count, there have been 103 lawsuits filed in the last 20 days, and judges had issued 50 restraining orders. 50 restraining orders requiring the Trump admin to reverse the SEVIS terminations. Those decisions came in more than 23 states and from judges appointed by several presidents, including Trump. Under F-1 immigration policies, look at that. See, look, our courts are doing their job. That's good.
Wrong, and I do think that this is exactly what needs to be resisted and reimagined.
Is Trump, in the work you do, after you've done books like this, with the knowledge of American history you have, does it make him look to you like a more or less familiar figure? Does he feel like a manifestation of something common, or does he seem very distinctive?
Well, I think one of the things that makes him seem so, quote, distinctive and unprecedented is, if you think about the national level, where, there's no question that it would be very difficult to find anybody who has ascended to the presidency and has behaved in the cruel and demeaning, not only to people, but to institutions, to his political enemies. But I do think that if one is aware of what has gone on over the course of U.S. history on the state and local levels.
And George Wallace.
Wallace is certainly the case, and he's somebody I think who's really important, who did become a national figure, and I don't know what would have happened if it wasn't for the assassin's bullet in 1972, which basically pushed him out of a race that he was in the process of maybe winning. So, but you think about a world that was organized around slavery and the personal domination of people who were enslavers. You think about a variety of what one scholar has called authoritarian enclaves, not only in the South but in other parts of the United States, where there were hierarchies of power that were long existing and that were supported by a lot of people because they basically saw benefits that came from it. And I think one of the things we have to understand about illiberalism and illiberal communities or sensibilities.
Was that outside? Was that my computer?
I think one of the things we have to understand about illiberalism and illiberal communities or sensibilities is that there was a lot in them that was satisfying. I mean, when people who were in the Klan in the 1920s were interviewed later, they couldn't understand. I mean, I'm talking about ordinary people like in Indiana, which was a state that was pretty much dominated by the Klan. They didn't get this. They didn't see themselves as being involved in an extremist organization. They saw themselves involved in an organization that was reinforcing community ideas, that was providing for recreation, that was embedding notions about what it means to be an American, a white person, a Christian. They may not even articulate it that way, except for being a Christian. So I think one of the things we need to understand is that it's not simply those moments of rage that we can identify and then ask, why does that happen? It's a way of life that can go on in very prosaic ways until they're being threatened, and then they erupt. But we need to understand the day-to-day lives that are created, that bring people together, that provide them with all sorts of meaning in their lives. And I think one of the things that is important about recognizing, say, illiberalism as a important current and field of force is that we have a tendency of looking at the disruptions of the liberal tradition as simply a backlash, as angry people who are venting their fury, and which doesn't really have a lot of substance, and things can go back to normal easily. And I think that that's a serious mistake.
It also gets to something that I think has been a very common fantasy, which is that you can destroy this tendency. Right? Maybe it's if you beat Donald Trump in the 2016 election or the 2020 election. Now I think people don't hold this view anymore, but that it was something that you could crush or you could suppress. You can make the things that are dominant in illiberal thought unsayable in polite society. You can make them illegal or unconstitutional, and that you can sort of push them to the margin. Having pushed to the margin, they don't really have a way back in, and they'll sort of fade away and wither, and that'll be the end of them. And I think something we're seeing with Trump is that suppression can work, but then if it fails all at once. And it turns out the thing you were trying to suppress is much stronger than you understood it to be. But I do think one of the reckonings that liberalism is going through right now is a recognition that it doesn't go back. It's not like maybe Nikki Haley just wins and then we're just done with this whole era. That it's not the sort of the more comfortable Republican Democratic cleavage that was around in the 90s or the 2000s to people. It's now this liberal illiberal cleavage, which probably has much deeper roots. And there's not going to be an approach to suppression that's going to work. And there's also not going to be any final victory over it, right? You're just in this fight for the foreseeable future until something you cannot predict changes in some way you cannot currently predict, and maybe not in a way that you would like.
Well,
the tree of liberalism needs to be watered by the fresh blood of populism. Just kidding.
You used the word fantasy, and I think that's a very good one because in 2016, I think there was a sense, first of all, that there was a sense that there was no way he was going to win. But even when he won, I think there was a sense that this was a very unusual, very toxic phenomenon that could, once you defeat him, would be defeated. Now, obviously, we've learned that this is not the case. And, I remember shortly after he was inaugurated in 2017, there was a big demonstration in Los Angeles, and someone was carrying a sign which was, "I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit." And the answer to that is you're always going to be protesting this shit because there are no final victories of anything. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that politics are very volatile, that people's political sensibilities do not fit into very neat boxes. When Bernie Sanders was running in 2016, there were more than a few people who said that Bernie Sanders would be someone who would be very appealing and that, they ended up voting for Trump. But, somehow or other, Sanders also, touched them in ways that they found, very significant, that he understood what
they're both also fundamentally anti-institutional candidates.
Right.
And very different in the way they're
very
anti-institutional
different.
candidates.
No, in some ways.
But I think we now understand this is a much more fundamental cleavage than people were looking at it as then.
Absolutely. I think that's right. But I also feel, I sort of finished the book with an example of this movement in a county in East Texas in the late 19th century where, someone who was part of a community of enslavers and someone who was part of a community of enslaved came together for basically opportunistic reasons because they shared grievance with what was going on and they knew they couldn't win local office without forming some kind of coalition. But little by little, they actually began to do it. Little by little, they learned a lot about each other. And in fact, over many years, they came to establish their own republic in the biracial republic where the white people who were the insurgents learned a lot about the needs of the black community, and the black community was able to engage with what was 30 or 40% of the white community. And even then they called themselves populists in the 1890s, and even when the populists nationally lost, they were still winning. And, in the end, they were gunned down.
It's not the most stirring example.
But I think it's an example of the way in which really meaningful coalitions and political connections are forged, recognizing things that are beneficial to everybody.
Let me ask you about liberalism itself.
Okay.
I would say over the past decade in particular, liberalism has felt very exhausted and very insecure. And its great victories are taken for granted. Now we're, I think, realizing again that it's actually quite remarkable for people to have rights, for there to be due process, for there to be courts where things can be checked, and for those courts to be listened to by the political system.
You can prioritize the lasers to shoot only the smallest of asteroids. The only reason I have lasers on here is because if I'm parked somewhere and I'm back here, I can just have the lasers shooting at asteroids that are going to wander into my ship. That's what these lasers are back here for. But I think the issue that I'm running into is I think that the accumulators can only output so much power. So when all of my machines are processing shit, it's just trying to draw too much power at once, and then it's all getting short-circuited. So I'm just trying to efficiency module shit so that stops happening.
Despite the fact that they don't force that judgment at the point of a gun. And liberalism was, I think, sort of beset by critics on the left who felt it never achieved enough, right? Barack Obama did not make our society post-racial, did not solve inequality, did not solve climate change. What has doing all this work made you think about liberalism itself and what a renewed version of politics around that tradition might look like?
One of the things we have to remember is that the sense of rights that people can enjoy, the sense of rights that people are entitled to, were products of very, very divisive and very, very, in some cases, violent struggles. And that the period of time that we're talking about when this was true is pretty short. One of the things I was really trying to do in my book was what I would call decentering liberalism. The liberal tradition, as I try to argue, is really something that's kind of invented in the 1940s and 1950s and holds on in many remarkable ways. But part of the problem with liberalism is that it...
Yeah, I could just disable them while moving, but I would have to put on... right now, they won't shoot if the capacitor is only at 50%. So I would have to put on another thing to add two signals together, and I would have to say, because I would want to say, when this is at 50 and when the speed is at 0, then it outputs a signal. Fuck, what's the thing I'm looking for? What logic machine do I need for that? I can do it, fuck it.
Never really dealt very well with the issues of power. And therefore, when push comes to shove, they abandon ship, or they sort of put together projects and policies that are not going to work or become self-contradictory. If what we're after is some of the things that liberals and liberalism at least say that they're interested in, a more egalitarian society, a world in which globally as well as nationally and locally, where it's possible for people regardless of their social, economic, racial, or ethnic background to pursue a life that is meaningful to them, if we're actually interested in that, as opposed to rhetorically interested in that, then we have to face up to really what liberalism has been inadequate. You write about, in a sense, liberalism's failure to be visionary. And I think that's true. What about, what a future could look like? And then the question of how you get there is related to what a future could look like.
So I hear people make this move a lot. Liberalism has had its failures. It has not gotten us to utopia, though it's had quite profound successes. So we need something that is better at confronting power. And then I will say the question I'll ask you, but I'm pretty sure I know the answer to it. Can you point me, in all the states we have, the history in the different countries, of a place where this alternative politics has emerged and has been better at containing right-wing liberalism, has been better at pushing forward the engines of human progress? I'd sort of like to see...
Out today, 6 p.m. Eastern, the final installment of our Lost Episodes series. Are they ever going to put out the... Oh, that is the Hassan one. I wonder why didn't they publish the Hassan one? I'm so curious. What happened? Wait, 1 minute break.
You're somewhat of a fashion icon.
Okay.
So I'm gonna show some of your best looks.
Oh, here we go.
Here's the famous one. Here's the famous one.
Oh no!
Here's the famous one. Okay, so here we go. This is the famous one. The jeans don't get enough love.
So that was I gotta stop wearing my friends' merchandise. That was.
Why would you say this? Just own it, bruv. How are you going to have the aesthetic and then deny the aesthetic at the same time? If you want to be the LARPy revolutionary, then be the LARPy... What do you mean, I got to stop wearing my friend's clothing? Oh my god.
That was a dude who was doing graphics design at the Young Turks at the time.
Bro,
he's an anarchist.
He's an anarchist?
Yeah.
He's like the Joker? This one, you got killed on this one.
Okay, let's see.
This one you got killed on.
Oh yeah, that's another...
Yeah.
So
it looks almost like you're being like a little bit...
So that lady was like, "Can I have that? Like, can I have that sweater?"
I hope
and
you gave it to her.
I did. No, I didn't. I was like, I need to take more photos.
I'm calling the police. This is my favorite look of yours.
Which one? Okay.
Let's see it right here.
What the fuck is that?
That's you at the.
Who is that guy?
That's you, no?
See the small example of it working before I say, well, that's where our politics should go. That's what we should excavate. So when you say that, what are you looking towards?
Historically, I think there have been important moments in the past where social movements have, even if they haven't entirely won or were able to gain political power as we think about abolitionism, which took on the biggest, the most intractable power in the United States. And I think about abolitionism as black abolitionism and about enslaved people who managed to take down a system of plantation slavery that had created the wealthiest people in the United States and people who owned disproportionate power. Now but
Lincoln emerges in your book almost as a villain.
Well, I don't see Lincoln as a villain, but what I would do is what I was trying to do there was to talk about some of the limitations. And I don't see putting Lincoln, then he's just a racist, because I think that's not a useful way of understanding Lincoln. If anything, you see somebody who grew and changed in very, very significant ways, but at the same time, he kind of embodied a lot of the contradictions about what a national family is and who would be included in that family.
I guess that's what I'm getting at here about this embodying of the contradiction. Something that I was thinking about reading your book a lot, and it relates to my own struggle with the realization that there is no final victory. And that if you understand the kinds of politics, the liberal currents that you're writing about, the field of force, I think you called it, which I liked, if you understand it is ever present. The political scientist Larry Bertels talks about the populist right as a reservoir, not a wave, but a reservoir that's always there to tap into. Then it becomes more obvious in a way that the national figures who can...
Want to invest in a complete travel streaming setup, double laptop, separate screen, camera and a green screen. That way you can leave the day before events and stream when you do it. Because it's just usually I don't like it streaming around. There's always just dumb shit that comes up. Like the internet will end up being laggy, and then that'll fucking piss me off. Or people want to go out and like chat, or like meetings will come up or whatever, and it's just fuck all that.
Can lead in this country will have to embody some of the contradictions. The idea that you will have a pure movement is not going to happen. And the reason why the pure movements tend to fail is that politics is about the contradictions, and it's about absorbing them, hopefully in a way that moves them more towards justice and just outcomes and vision and the things that I would like to see in the world too. But I guess that sort of movement between this illiberalism is always here and always powerful, and so sort of almost anybody you look at has had to embody some of its contradictions, even if they're pushing away from it. And then also the sort of political verdict that, well, isn't there something that doesn't have any of these contradictions that we can use as the weapon that will finally win? I'm curious how you resolve that, because you're the person, not me, who's been sitting in every single decade of American history is full of a very potent illiberalism that nobody ever quite seems to be able to push into the back room for very long.
I don't think there's any such thing as a pure movement. As a friend of mine put it, if you want to build a movement where everyone has to fit through the eye of a needle, forget it. And, frankly, most social movements don't last very long. But if you're going to build a movement, which I think about in a large way of consequence, I think there's, if you're serious, and if power is actually what you're interested in, and change, and using power for the point of change that will be
Politics,
appeal
guys.
to large numbers of people who want change and whose lives can actually be better. I think a central issue is to confront this. It's that I understand why you think that. And maybe there are ways that we can move, recognizing that no one's going to be fully changed, and that you're always going to be protesting this shit, because there's no such thing as a victory, even if you like your side winning, that there's going to be ongoing struggles, ongoing need for vigilance, ongoing need for self-criticism. And we have to find ways of reckoning our ideals and ambitions and visions and utopianism. People are not going to put themselves on the line for a world that they can't quite imagine. And I think that is a basis for something bigger. It's always going to be an ongoing process of rethinking, interrogating, and changing, being open to change.
I think that's a good place to end. Always a final question. What are 3 books you recommend to the audience?
Okay.
The books!
Well, first of all, I think Tocqueville's Democracy in America would be a good place to start. Not going into it thinking of it as the iconic text, but going into it thinking about it as someone who is an observer from the outside looking in, and who has, both admiration and reservations. 2 other books. Elizabeth Hinton's book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, which focuses on the 1960s into the early 1970s, and is, I think, a very, very interesting way of understanding how illiberal sensibilities kind of infuse their way into what are major modern liberal projects and pave the way for mass incarceration, which I learned a lot from. And the third book is a book by Lawrence Powell called Troubled Memory, Anne Levy, The Holocaust, and David Duke's Louisiana. It's an extraordinary story about a woman who was part of the only whole family to make it out of the Lotz ghetto. And they end up in New Orleans. And when Duke runs for governor, she plays an incredibly important role in outing his Nazi past and helping to undermine his pretty, his claims to power. So it kind of links fascism on both sides of the Atlantic with an incredibly inspiring and well-told story.
Stephen Hahn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, that guy didn't look like a Han, but he was.